I hid my curves under plain dresses, but the Mafia boss noticed what no one else did. The first time Salvatore Kellen looked at me, everyone else in that Boston conference room looked straight through me, and I understood exactly why. I had spent 16 years teaching my curves to disappear, hiding them inside loose dresses the color of old dishwater. What I could not understand was why the most feared man in the city kept watching the one woman I had worked so hard to erase. Two questions would not leave me. What did he want from me? And why had someone already begun following me home? My name is Camille Rhodes, and I am 36 years old. I made a quiet living as a forensic bookkeeper, the woman small companies hired when their records had been damaged, stolen, or tangled until nobody could tell where the money had gone. I was good at my work. I was even better at being forgettable. Loose gray and brown dresses, flat shoes, hair pulled back, no jewelry, a voice so soft it asked for nothing. I took the chair nearest the door, close enough to leave without a single head turning. It was not modesty, it was armor. Salvatore Kellen was 51 and the head of Kellen Holdings, and everyone knew his polite hotels and handsome brick offices sat on top of something far older and far less lawful. He was patient, and he never asked twice. When his lawyer called, I almost said no. The money was excellent, but I was being hired to learn why profitable buildings were suddenly bleeding on paper, and no honest answer to that question ever made anyone safe. Still, I buttoned my coat and went, telling myself the old lie. Keep your head down, Camille. Do the numbers. Get out. The lobby was marble and polished brass, every detail arranged to put visiting money at ease, and it should have calmed me. Instead, my pulse climbed the instant I saw the photographer setting up near the desk. A group of smiling, tailored employees was being gathered in front of the windows for a staff portrait. I shifted sideways at once, putting a wide stone column between the camera and my body, but a young executive still noticed the movement. His eyes crawled over me the way a man assesses damaged goods, and I closed my cardigan across my chest and turned away, pretending to study the directory. That is when I saw Salvatore. He had been standing near the security desk, half hidden by a planter, and he had not been watching the photographer or the smiling employees. He had been watching me, absorbing every small retreat I made with no expression at all. When our eyes met, he did not smile and he did not look away. He gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when he has already decided something, and turned toward the elevator as if nothing had passed between us. It unnerved me more than any threat, because I could not tell whether he had seen a problem to solve or a woman to consume. Upstairs, the man behind the enormous desk was nothing like the cold daydream I had built on the way over. He wasted no words on flattery. He slid a folder across the desk and told me his problem the way a surgeon announces a diagnosis. Several of his hotels and properties had begun showing up in internal summaries as weak, over-leveraged, and barely worth holding. The worrying part was that the real businesses underneath those summaries were healthy. Someone had gone to great trouble to make profitable assets look as if they were sinking. I opened the folder and felt the old familiar click, the one that happens when a pattern begins to reveal itself. Within 20 minutes, I found the first distortion. A maintenance reserve quietly tripled against a building that needed no such work, and I looked up to find him watching me with an interest that had nothing to do with the papers. Most people start by telling me what they want to hear, he said, his voice low. You started with what the numbers told you. That is why you are here. A compliment from a man like him felt like a door onto stairs I had not agreed to climb. He showed me 3 properties that afternoon, and at every one I found the same quiet signature. The truthful record sat buried beneath a newer layer of figures, convincing to a lender, but false the moment you checked them against the actual rent rolls. Someone with legitimate access was repainting a healthy company as a distressed one, and they wanted outside money to believe Salvatore was losing his grip. It was not simple embezzlement. The goal was to drive down the price of everything he owned so someone else could buy it apart at a discount. After that first long day, he called me into a private meeting room, and when it ended, he did something I still cannot explain. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a crumpled coffee shop receipt, and pressed it into my palm, closing my fingers over it. "Keep the original," he said. "Never scan it. Do not even tell anyone I gave it to you." Then he was gone before I could ask, leaving me alone with a receipt for coffee I had never seen him drink. I carried it in my coat pocket like a key I did not yet understand. In the days that followed, I began to watch Salvatore the way he watched me. I saw how he spoke to the people who worked in his buildings, not with the booming voice of a man performing power, but with a patient, nearly gentle attention. He knew the night doorman by name, and the older woman who had run the breakfast room at one of his hotels for 30 years. And when a young manager tried to have her moved aside because she was slowing things down, Salvatore listened and then asked, "Has she ever failed you?" The room went still. His fearsome reputation and his private conduct did not quite match. That same week, I noticed I was being followed. A dark car sat too long across the street from my Cambridge apartment, and a man lingered near the bus stop, reading no newspaper at all. One night I came home to find my front door unlocked, and on the kitchen table lay a single typed line that made my stomach drop. "Stop reading the books, or you will be buried under them." I had told Salvatore part of what I found, and already someone else had decided the erasing of me was worth preparing for. The sensible thing was to walk away, hand back the retainer, and vanish into the same gray distance I had chosen years ago. I did not. Some deep and stubborn part of me, the girl who had once loved solving puzzles more than she feared being seen, refused to let a handful of frightened numbers drive her out. So I returned to work, carrying the receipt in my pocket, and the second one came after a meeting I was not supposed to remember. Salvatore and I had spent 2 hours in a hotel being quietly prepared for sale, and I had shown him how a sound property was being presented to lenders as overextended. When I finished, he nodded and handed me a folded slip from a parking garage 3 miles from where he had parked. "You are collecting proof of where you have been," I said. "Proof is for people who expect to be called liars," he answered. "I am building something else." That night I could not sleep, so I spread every receipt across my kitchen table and read them again like pages of a code I had not yet cracked. Coffee, parking, a pharmacy, a dry cleaner. The amounts were ordinary and the locations scattered, and none of it connected to the empire he ran. Some of those purchases were things I could not imagine Salvatore Kellen buying for himself, which told me the items were never the point. I first read them as paranoia, the habit of a man who had spent his life among thieves, but that did not satisfy me. By the end of my second week, I had enough to name the real problem. The sickness inside Kellen Holdings was deliberate and selective, moving through the hands of one man on its way to the outside world. That man was Martin Keene, the chief portfolio officer who had spent years building his name as the one who modernized how the firm reported its numbers. Every distorted summary passed through his desk, and every pessimistic projection carried his stamp. He was not the architect, I realized. He was the open door the architect kept walking through. I took what I knew to Salvatore, and for the first time I watched real anger surface behind his calm. He did not shout or reach for a phone. He looked at my evidence and asked whether I could prove it in a way that would survive a courtroom, and when I said not yet, he trusted my caution. "If we move now," he said, "we flush out the door, but not the man who built it." He called Martin an instrument, not an enemy, and asked me to keep watching while the world believed I had stopped. That request told me what kind of fight I had walked into. So I kept watching, and as spring softened the Boston streets, something else began happening between us, something I had no training for and no words to describe. Salvatore started including me in property visits that had nothing to do with my ledgers, and I pretended the invitations were about the buildings. He would walk with me through empty hotel corridors and ask my opinion, not because he needed a bookkeeper, but because he wanted to hear how I thought. I began to notice how he never let his hand hover at my back or steer me by the elbow the way powerful men steered women they intended to possess. He offered distance freely, and I found myself trusting it the way a person trusts a fire after years of cold. The longer I watched him with his own people, the harder it became to hold on to the story I had built about who he was. One afternoon, a housekeeper dropped a tray of glasses in a hotel lobby, and the young manager moved toward her with his mouth already open. Salvatore stopped him with a raised palm. "She has cleaned this hotel through 3 owners," he said. He bent down, picked up the largest piece of glass himself, and carried it to the bin. A man known for terrifying half the city had chosen to kneel rather than shame a woman in front of strangers, and that image stayed with me a long time. I want to pause here because I know what some of you are hoping this story will be. I know you have heard 100 tales where the dangerous man sweeps the hidden woman out of her gray clothes and teaches her to love her own reflection, and I do not blame you for expecting it now. If you have ever been the woman in the back of the room, tugging her sweater over her stomach and pretending not to hear the laughter, then this part is for you. If you want to see how a woman who spent years learning to vanish finally stands her ground, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the turn coming. Stay with me, because what comes next is where the story stops being about what Salvatore saw and becomes about what I was brave enough to do. The problem was that I could not simply enjoy his company, because Martin Keene had begun paying attention to me in a way that made my skin crawl. He was polished and careful, always the first to offer coffee or hold a door, and he asked about my work with the soft persistence of a man taking inventory. "Where did you grow up?" he would say. "Do you have family in the city? How long will Salvatore be keeping you so late?" Each question arrived wrapped in courtesy. I heard the intent underneath. He was not curious about me, he was mapping me, the way a surveyor maps land he plans to build on. And it frightened me in a way the following car never had. Then my stepbrother called, and the past I had spent 9 years outrunning came back all at once. Everett Rhodes, 44, polished and certain of his charm, could make a demand sound like a kindness. "Camille," he said, using my name the way a man tests a key in a lock. "It has been too long. We should have dinner." What I heard in his careful warmth was the thing his family had always believed. They remembered me only when I became useful. Now that I was inside Salvatore's circle, I was the most useful I had ever been. I agreed to dinner because I needed to see the trap before I walked into it, and because I refused to sit in my apartment wondering what shape it would take. Everett chose a quiet steakhouse in the seaport, the kind of room where money whispered and every waiter knew which fork went where. He stood when I arrived, kissed my cheek, and told me I looked exactly the same. In his family's language, that meant no one had needed to look at me too closely. For an hour, he talked about our late father's business, polishing a memory he hoped would make a sale. Then he lowered his voice. "People underestimate what you can do, Camille. I have watched you waste that talent for too long. A consortium I work with has been looking at several of Salvatore's properties, and the valuations keep shifting in confusing ways. You are inside now. You could tell me where the real numbers sit." He called it coming home, called it family looking after its own. And for one terrible second, the old hunger rose in me like heat. They had spent my adult life teaching me that being noticed was dangerous. And now here they were, finally noticing, and every word of it was bait. I sat very still. What Everett misread is the difference between wanting approval and wanting the truth. I had spent years believing those two things were the same, and his family had been happy to keep me confused. But Salvatore had done something my stepfamily never once managed. He had respected my boundaries without asking for a reward, and in doing so, he had shown me what unconditional actually felt like. The old hunger was still there, but it no longer owned me. I heard his flattery for what it was, and I knew I would not sell Salvatore to feed a family that only loved me when I became worth something. I excused myself to the restroom. My phone felt heavy in my hand. and I understood the choice with a clarity that nearly knocked the breath from me. I could carry Everett's proposition in secret and decide alone what was best for the man I was beginning to love, or I could do the thing my stepfamily would never predict and tell Salvatore everything. When I returned, I smiled at Everett and said I would think carefully about his offer. I watched relief soften his shoulders. He had mistaken my calm for surrender, and that mistake would eventually cost him everything. That night, I went straight to Salvatore's townhouse in Beacon Hill, unannounced. He answered the door in his shirt sleeves, and when he saw my face, he said nothing, simply stepped back and let me in. We sat in his study with low lamplight between us, and I told him every word Everett had spoken, every old wound that had flared. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I would have understood if they still had a hold on you," he said. Then he asked what I wanted to do. That single question undid me, because no one had ever asked it in a room where my answer actually mattered. I told him I wanted to end it, not just for him but for myself, to prove once and for all that I was not the woman my family needed me to be. So we built the counter-operation together that night, leaning over his coffee table like old conspirators while the city slept. 3 trusted insiders, Martin Keene among them, would each receive a different and believable weakness about a different property. Each false story would tempt a specific kind of buyer, and each would carry a hidden marker only Salvatore and I understood. The rest of the company would be left in the dark. That was the true purpose of the receipts, though it took me longer to piece together than it should have. Each crumpled slip was an offline version tag, a physical record of one private disclosure that never touched the compromised digital system. A coffee receipt matched an invented vacancy crisis. A parking stub matched a faked refinancing problem. A grocery receipt matched a manufactured structural cost. Because the markers existed only on paper, in my coat pocket, and in Salvatore's memory, Martin and whoever stood behind him could never discover which false story was being traced back to which leak. The man who controlled the company's information could not control what had never been entered into a machine. Weeks passed, and the work was slow and dangerous, and threaded through with moments I will keep for as long as I live. Salvatore and I fell into the habit of late dinners, and I began to tell him things I had never told anyone. The small cruelties and old griefs. He listened without flinching and without pity, the way a man listens when he knows the story is not asking to be fixed. In return, he let me see the ragged edges of his own life, the violence he had inherited and the loneliness it produced. The night he first touched my hand, he did not take it the way men had always taken things from me. He set his palm open on the table beside mine and waited, unmoving, until I chose to lay my own hand inside it. That restraint cracked the last of my armor. I had been touched my whole life by people who demanded, or pitied, or measured me against a number on a scale. And here was a man who understood that the only gift he could offer was room to move toward him first. When our fingers joined, something in me that had been holding its breath for 36 years let go at last. Martin Keene, meanwhile, began to push harder, and through watching him I caught the first clear scent of the architect behind the scheme. He pressed for centralized digital reporting at every meeting, and insisted that Salvatore's love of paper was sentimental and slow, and each time he argued, I saw the real purpose shining through. A system where everything was scanned and searchable was a system where Martin could read our false stories side by side and discover they did not match. He wanted not efficiency, but visibility, and the harder he fought for it, the more certain I became that the man writing his instructions knew exactly which piece of the puzzle would expose us. As July arrived, Salvatore and I knew the moment for the public break had come. We planned it in his study in the small hours, using no phones and no computers, the way we had planned everything that mattered. Everett's syndicate had grown greedy enough to believe every whispered warning about failing foundations and vanished refinancing, but greed alone would not persuade them to sign. They needed to believe Salvatore was broken, isolated, and abandoned by the only person who could have saved him. That person was me, and I was about to hand them the lie they were so desperate to believe. The board meeting was held in the same marble conference room where I had first watched Salvatore across a crowded lobby, and I wore the same plain gray dress, buttoned tight, a choice no one else would understand. When my turn came, I stood and laid out figures that appeared to prove Salvatore had knowingly misrepresented a performance of his properties. I said he had deceived his lenders and his own people, and I said it in a voice so steady I barely recognized it. He did not defend himself. He sat with his hands folded, wearing the face of a man watching everything he had built slip through his fingers. I resigned and walked out, and the silence behind me was the loudest sound I have ever heard. In the lobby, cameras flashed and people stared with the thrilled horror reserved for a public execution. I kept my head down and my coat closed and let them see exactly what they expected. The invisible woman finally visible and betraying the man who had trusted her. Later I learned that even some of Salvatore's loyal executives believed it, and thinking of them made it hurt more than I was ready to admit. Everett's car was waiting across from my apartment within the hour. My stepbrother embraced me the way a man embraces a prize he has won at auction. "Camille," he said, beaming, "you have finally proven what you have always had. Mother will be so proud." The words landed exactly where his family had aimed them my entire life, at the soft place where I still wanted to be seen as something other than a burden. I let the tears come because they helped the performance. He thought I was crying from relief at being welcomed home. I was crying because I finally understood how little their welcome had ever been worth. The Rhodes family acted out their own betrayal with a skill that would have impressed me if it had not been so familiar. My stepmother Patrice, who had spent my teenage years teaching me that a girl who drew a man's eye had invited whatever came next, now fussed over my clothes and told acquaintances how brilliant I was. She spoke my name the way she spoke her own accomplishments, as if I had only now become real. At dinner she touched my arm and smiled, and I smiled back around food I could hardly swallow, because I knew what this affection was. They had not learned to love me. They had learned that I was useful. Meanwhile, the reports I fed back into the family were carefully shaped, and each false vulnerability carried its own quiet marker in Salvatore's memory. Everett's consortium moved through shell companies with the confidence of men who had already won, entering conditional purchase agreements for the supposedly distressed properties at deep discounts. The terms Salvatore offered were almost too generous, seller financing so attractive no buyer could refuse, and woven into every contract was a clause most of them read too fast. Each buyer had to certify ultimate beneficial ownership, funding sources, and controlling partners. They signed eagerly, and never looked at what their own paperwork was confessing. The strangest part of those weeks was not the deception, but the fact that I missed Salvatore with a physical ache no strategy could quiet. I sat through family dinners and answered my stepmother's prying questions while carrying his last words to me like a stone against my ribs. "Do not call," he had said, "not until it is finished. Whatever happens, remember the woman who walked into that boardroom." The performance we were giving the world had stopped being a performance between us long ago. The distance was not proof of a falling out. It was the price we paid so the truth could survive to the end. I will not pretend I was never afraid. Every night I lay in the guest room of my stepbrother's brownstone and listened to the house settle, wondering whether Martin Keene had found the loose thread that would hang us, whether some careless word had already given us away. The danger was not a gun so much as a slow unraveling. One wrong number fed to the wrong man, collapsing our whole structure. But fear, I had learned from Salvatore, was not a signal to stop. It was proof that I could see the hole in the floor and still choose to walk over it, and each morning I chose again. The final closing was set for the last Friday of August, in a high conference room of a downtown law firm, and I dressed for it the way a soldier dresses for the last morning of a long war. I wore gray, my familiar armor, though I buttoned it with a steadiness that surprised me. That morning I gathered every receipt Salvatore had ever pressed into my palm, months of coffee cups and parking stubs and pharmacy slips, and laid them in a folder in the order I would need them. They had never been scanned and never spoken aloud. They were about to become the only weapon in the room that silence had kept alive. Everett rode with me in the elevator, radiant with triumph, talking the whole way about what this day meant for our family. "You have done something that matters, Camille," he said, straightening his tie in the mirrored doors. "Everyone dismissed you, and now you are the reason the road's name finally wins." I looked at our two reflections side by side and thought how strange it was that he could be looking directly at me and still not see the person standing there. He saw only the key he had finally learned to turn. The conference room was full of lawyers and financiers and men who wore their wealth like armor. And near the head of the table sat Martin Keene, looking pleased. The syndicate's men moved through the closing documents with practiced speed, initialing where the little tabs told them to initial, while Everett leaned back like a king surveying a conquered province. The seat that should have held Salvatore stood empty, and more than one man glanced at it and smiled. They read his absence as surrender. It was the first thing they got wrong. When the documents were nearly signed, Everett turned to me and raised his voice enough that the whole room could hear. "To Camille," he said, who reminded us that family is the only thing that survives. Then he told me warmly that I had finally proven I belonged. For a long moment I let the words hang there and felt the room waiting for me to blush and accept my place. Instead, I stood, opened my folder, and began to lay out across that polished table what I had carried through every danger of the summer, one receipt after another, until the row of papers stretched between us like a wound slowly being opened. Nobody spoke, because nothing on the table looked significant, and that was the point. I held up the first. "This is the hotel vacancy crisis Everett's people bought 3 weeks ago." I laid it beside the second. "This is the refinancing panic." Then I walked them through it, meeting by meeting, false valuation by false valuation, until the pattern was undeniable. The merchant, the timestamp, and the location of each physical receipt corresponded to one specific disclosure, one executive, and one buyer reaction, and every one of those routes passed through the same man. Martin Keene had stopped breathing, the color leaving his face as the architecture of the trap closed around him. He was the internal door, the conduit who had moved each false weakness from our secret meetings out to Everett's syndicate, and his own timestamps were now recorded on paper that had never entered the machines he controlled. Everett tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked in the middle. I opened the second half of the trap beneath them all. The buyers already submitted their ownership and financing certifications to get these generous terms, I said, turning to the lawyers. Their own paperwork names the common partners they have spent years denying. Greed had made them write their secrets down and sign them. At that moment the doors opened and Salvatore Kellen walked in, and the sight of him did more damage to Everett than every word I had spoken. He was not the broken man my stepbrother had imagined. He was calm and whole and unmistakably in command. "I was never your operative," I said to Everett, and my voice did not shake. "I went to him the same night you offered me a way home, and everything you bought from me afterward was a lie we fed you on purpose." Everett stared at me as if I had changed languages in front of him. What broke him was not the money or the exposure, though both were catastrophic. It was the realization that his old blind spot had finally collapsed the floor beneath him. He had believed all our lives that everyone wanted approval as badly as he wanted power, and he had built a conspiracy on the certainty that his sister's hunger for family was a lever he could pull. I had stopped needing their approval long before he noticed. Salvatore did not raise his voice or reach for a threat, and that restraint was its own kind of violence in a room full of men expecting blood. He explained, in the same calm he used to announce a diagnosis, that the acquisitions would be halted before any title transferred, and the certifications already signed had exposed the hidden network behind the attack. Martin's authority collapsed because the representations he had made contradicted what his own conduct proved. Everett's financing partners scattered before the meeting ended, and I watched my stepbrother shrink in his chair until he looked smaller than the boy who once taught me to disappear. I have been asked why I did not leave that room with my stepfamily begging, or deliver the long speech I had practiced for years. The answer is simpler than people expect. When Patrice tried to catch my eye as the room emptied, I understood that the thing I had wanted from her was not love. It was permission, a permission I had spent 36 years waiting to receive from people who were never going to give it. I told her, quietly, that affection offered only after someone becomes useful is not the same as love, and then I turned to Salvatore and walked out beside him without looking back. Some doors deserve to close without a speech. In the weeks that followed, the empire settled into order, though the ground beneath us had shifted. Martin Keene was removed from Kellen Holdings, stripped of the authority and protections he had counted on, and the civil consequences of his signed representations would follow him for the rest of his working life. Everett's network did not need to be attacked. It unraveled on its own as lenders discovered the hidden cross-connections their own greed had forced into daylight. I also refused what Salvatore offered me next, because I had not come this far to trade one kind of dependence for another. He offered to finance whatever I wanted, and I told him no as gently as the word could be said. I will build my own practice, I told him, and I will choose my own clients. He considered that, truly considered it, and then he nodded with something that looked very much like pride. Good, he said. I would not know what to do with a woman who needed me to own her. In one sentence was the whole difference between him and every man who had come before. So I found a small office on a quiet Cambridge street and hung my own name on the door, and my first steady client was the man whose empire I had helped save. It was an arrangement of equals now, and it felt like the first true thing I had ever signed. The work came slowly and then steadily, the way honest work does, and people brought me the records that frightened them because I had become known for the one quality that had once been used against me. I noticed what everyone else was too busy to see. All of that mattered, but it is not what I think about when I tell this story. I think about the night, several weeks after the closing, when Salvatore and I finally went to dinner without a strategy to plan or a secret to protect. I chose an elegant fitted dress, deep green and cut close, the kind my younger self would have returned to the rack before ever trying on. Over it I wore my old plain coat, the same gray armor that had carried me through 1,000 rooms where I wanted to vanish. I met him at a small restaurant near the harbor, and when the evening quieted, Salvatore looked at my coat and said not one word about it. He simply waited, the way he had always waited. That is the detail I want you to hold on to. He did not ask me to take the coat off. He did not reach to slide it from my shoulders or joke about the woman hiding inside. He let the choice remain entirely mine, and in that patient silence, I finally understood what he had seen in me from the first moment I closed my cardigan in that lobby. Every other man in my life had noticed me only when I became useful, or beautiful enough, or connected to power. Salvatore had noticed the woman deliberately disappearing long before I gave him permission to see more, and he had loved that woman enough to wait rather than take. I removed the coat myself, slowly, and laid it across the back of my chair, and I did not close my eyes or apologize. The dress did not transform me into someone new, because I had never needed to become someone new. It simply let the world see the woman who had always been standing there. Salvatore looked at me across the table, and what I saw in his face was not surprise or victory, but the recognition of a woman arriving fully into her own life. I would love to hear what you would have done. Would you have walked into that boardroom and handed your family exactly what they wanted? Or would you have trusted the man who saw you before you trusted yourself? Tell me in the comments, because there was no version of this story where I stayed behind the flower pots and waited. And I do not think there is one for you either. If this story gave you even a little of the courage it took me 36 years to find, Please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that disappearing is not the same as being free. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because somewhere out there is another hidden woman, ready to lay her coat across the back of a chair and finally allow herself to be seen. That is the whole story, and it is mine. Every receipt and every reckoning and every long night between. I did not lose the curves the world once told me to hide, and I did not trade one rescuer for another. What I gained was harder to describe and far more worth keeping. Privacy is healthy, but erasing yourself is not the same thing as choosing it, and the Mafia boss did not save me with a glance or a wardrobe or a single dramatic confession. He did not need to. What he gave me was the steady, unbothered patience of a man who saw the strategy in my gray dresses and refused to treat it as a flaw, who waited without demanding reward, and who trusted me to handle the fight my own way. In the end, the power was never his to hand me. He simply noticed what everyone else walked straight past, and then he stood still long enough for me to decide on my own terms that I was finally done hiding. Before him, I believed being seen was the same as being caught. After him, I understood the difference, and I have worn that understanding like the green dress ever since, close to the skin and chosen entirely by me.